This will be an intro to the book of Genesis. I wanted to explain some of the goals that I have in being in Genesis and with you, and hopefully you share them as well. I mean, I think the primary ones are, of course, the spiritual ones, right? Is to look at our origins, and there's so much to appreciate and savor when it comes to origins, to know God's original intent for us as humans, for relationships, for the planet. I think it can be deeply convicting, right? To know these things, to glimpse these things, and to be inspired by God's goodness and the beauty that He intended. Regardless of where we are at and how much of that we would say we're experiencing right now, it fuels a sense of longing, a longing to know God, and a hope, I think. There's this great quote from one of my favorite authors, J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings. He draws on the language of Genesis here. He says, "We all long for Eden, and we are constantly glimpsing it. Our whole nature is still soaked with the sense of exile, the sense that we are somehow at a distance from all the goodness that God fully intended." That is one way to explain exile. Looking at Eden and exile in the opening chapters, I think we'll get a deeper sense of what Tolkien means by that, and an appreciation that we long for a home that we've never experienced. No matter how good our parents are, no matter how great our home of origin was, we long for a home, and that restoration is really important. Genesis also portrays God's pattern of restoring the things that He designed with our partnership. So, for instance, just to spoil something, like by the end of Genesis, we get to Joseph, and Joseph sets up a microcosm of the Garden of Eden, but in Egypt, right? Like, and he feeds the world, and it's an incredible story and situation, deeply inspiring. It is amazing what God does, His patience in His partnership with people in order to set up experiences of Eden that are here with us still, even though we're in exile. God keeps trying to restore us to a garden. And there are questions there then of, well, why do we keep messing it up? Why do we run away? So we'll look at what does it mean to be human in that as well. I want to acknowledge a challenge, and that is when you think about writing an email, writing an essay, writing a professional letter, writing a book, writing poetry, we have technology or tools for emphasizing certain things, like capitalization, bold-facing, italicizing. We even have a structure that if you were educated in the US, that you learned the 5-paragraph essay. Like, what grade do we learn the 5-paragraph essay? Probably what, 7th grade, right? If you encountered a 5-paragraph essay, you would know, like, oh, okay, I know where the thesis is of this essay. I know where the topic sentences are. What's the supporting material? So I want you to think about, if you couldn't do that, if you couldn't capitalize, if you couldn't boldface, italicize, and for whatever reason you couldn't write a 5-paragraph essay, how would you write a persuasive kind of piece to someone? Rhythm, rhyming, and word choice. Absolutely. Now, let's make paper extremely rare. If we're in a primarily oral culture, you would try to make things memorable, punchy, witty, right? In addition to the repetition. And so those are some of the things that we have to look for in the book of Genesis. In fact, Genesis 1 is probably a poem. It was probably sung at different points. It's highly repetitious. And when we get into it next week, I think we'll need to appreciate it that way. Like this is their way of emphasizing certain things. Here's the next challenge. Words really depend on context to know what is being communicated. So take this phrase, I'm mad about my flat. What does that mean?
It could mean that you really like your apartment.
Where does it mean that?
It could
Places
mean
where they call an apartment a flat. Like Europe, most of the rest of the world, I guess.
Yeah, a lot of Europe, especially the UK, I think. If you're in the US, what does this phrase usually mean? I'm mad about my flat. I'm angry about my flat tire. Exactly. I'm mad about my flat. Now, why do I bring that up? It's because it's a great illustration of how you need context in order to know the what these words mean, right? Like we all know what these words mean. I'm mad about my flat, but you don't actually know what the person saying it is trying to say to you unless you have some more clues, some context clues. And so we're going to spend that's why I want to spend more time talking about the context of Genesis. Does it mean that words can mean anything you want them to mean? No, it does not mean that. But it means that context is what we have to look for in order to understand better what is being said. And this is the challenge with Genesis. This is ancient literature. So Genesis uses words like God. What does God mean? That's not something that we should just take for granted. Who is this? The first name of God is Elohim. El was the name of the Canaanite lead deity. And Elohim is kind of the Hebrew way of pluralizing it. Whenever you end with I am, it's the im, it's the plural form. So, okay, that's weird, but every time there's a subject verb agreement, it is a singular name. One way to translate the word God from Hebrew into English is it would be almost like this. Supreme Gods said this. So who is this? We're reading Genesis in order to get to know God. And here right away is this challenge. Like, what is the context here? The word day is also challenging because some people interpret day and every use of the word day to mean 24-hour period. And so if you know anything about how, like, creationists and evolutionists debated these kinds of things over 100 years ago, like that could be a source of questions or even a little embarrassment, like, well, what? Like, what do I think Genesis is saying about this? 6 or 7 days? Is that 24-hour? We'll look at that next time. And then garden. Being in exile for us means experiencing thorns and thistles. We experience gardening in ways that Adam and Eve did not. So what was that experience? What is a garden that they understood, that they experienced, that was like supposedly way better than what we have now? I just want to name words depend on context. And I'll try to give some historical background every time we encounter something that requires it. With that, I want to give a little bit of an overview to other ancient stories that Genesis was arguing with. So here's a little bit of context. What was it like to talk about creation stories in the ancient Near East, like in that part of the world, the Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East? There's at least four that we know of that were major, that Genesis 1 through 11 is one of them, and it seems to be arguing with the others. Here they are. Stasinos Cypria, which is a story about the Trojan War. So that's the Greek creation story. Then there's what's called the Atrahasis story, the Babylonian or Akkadian story. There's the Zoroastrian Avesta, which comes from old Iran. And then there's Genesis 1 through 11, which is the Hebrew creation story. I'm including all 11 chapters there. What's interesting about these stories is that they all have a 5-part structure. So this is not a 5-paragraph essay, but it does have the same kind of structure, which is you start with a creation scenario, and then there is a first threat, a second threat, a third threat, and then a resolution. This is the Greek creation story. And this is very condensed, but essentially you start with a creation that immediately becomes overpopulation. Becomes a problem. Like there's too many humans, and we humans cause noise. We annoy the gods. The gods just think, what have we done? This is a big mistake. And so the first threat to us is the Theban War. Zeus sends the Theban War, and a lot of people die. Then there's more population, right? The growth. Then Zeus plans to destroy everyone by thunderbolts. He's that mad. And a guy named Momos says, you don't want to do that. So he stops Zeus. So there's some kind of mediation. The third threat is there's a plan. And Thebes, one of the gods or goddesses, yes, marries a mortal man to create Achilles, right? The hero who was played by Brad Pitt in Troy. So that's Achilles. And Zeus fathers Helen of Troy, so the most beautiful woman of that time. And then everyone, or these men fight for her. So the Greeks and the barbarians, or the Trojans, fight the Trojan War. A lot of people die, and then the earth is lightened of her burden. That's the resolution. In the Atrahasis story, there is creation, which is said to be the work of the gods, and the creation, they create humans. The first threat, once again, is overcrowding. Humans numerically increase. The gods send a plague to limit the overcrowding. And there's a god named Enki, who is kind of like a Prometheus type figure. It's a god who like sympathizes with the humans and helps us out. Then there's a second threat. Humanity numerically increase again. The gods send a drought, and then Enki helps. The third threat, once again, humanity's numerical increase. There is a flood. Atrahasis is kind of like a Noah, and people are saved in a boat. The resolution is there continues to be numerical increase, but there's a compromise between two gods, and humans are cursed with natural barrenness, a high infant mortality rate, and cult prostitution, which separates sex and procreation. Okay, so there's a check on humans numerically increasing. Here's the Iranian story. In creation, Ahura Mazda tells Yima, who is also an Adam and Noah figure, to be king over creation. The first threat is overpopulation, and so Yima asks the earth goddess Armaiti to expand herself, like to make the planet bigger. The second threat, same thing, overpopulation. Yima asks Armaiti to expand herself. Third threat, same thing. And then there's a resolution. Ahura Mazda sends a deadly winter. There's heavy snowfall to punish the overcrowding. Yima builds an enclosure to survive, some kind of house. And outside of it, humanity is destroyed. But inside, a boy and a girl are born in the enclosure every 40 years. Okay, you follow. In Genesis 1 through 11, this is the Hebrew story. In Genesis 1, really to chapter 2, verse 3, but God creates the world and humans and blesses them to be fruitful and multiply. Okay? The first threat happens in chapters 2 through 4. There is a fall, and there is an exile from the garden, and God responds by promising victory to the seed of the woman. There's a title that is very strange, because typically the ancients would speak of the seed of a man, but this says seed of the woman. So somehow there's a future child like a Baby Yoda or something that's going to reboot the franchise. No, I'm just kidding. There is a child that will be born that uh, will somehow embody um, hope, strength, and victory over the serpent in some way. And and then, given that procreation is still part of the plan, Cain kills Abel and builds a city of violence, which is a double tragedy, right? Like for brother to turn on brother. So, but it identifies a problem. Problem is violence. And then God preserves Seth, another son of Adam and Eve, outside the city. So that's the first threat. The second threat is, once again, human violence that threatens Noah and the family of faith. God floods the world to protect them and restart creation. So the ark was big enough to house other people, but only 8 people said, yeah, I'm going to trust God and go with this plan. So that's the second threat. The third threat is that humans create a city and a tower. We call it the Tower of Babel. It was also a city, and God disperses them. So there's some kind of political dynamic happening there that we'll get to when we study it. And then even when God disperses them, humans build city states and kingdoms, and those are not good because we have seen Cain in chapter 4 build a city that was full of violence, and these are also violent. So that's the third threat. The resolution comes at the end in Genesis 11, and we get to meet Abraham and Sarah, or Avram and Sarai, and uh, and then God calls them out of the city state called Ur to begin Israel. So this is God's creation of Israel. That's different. Here's where we could discuss a little bit. Freimer Kensky is a scholar, and she says that this command to be fertile is an explicit and probably conscious rejection of the idea that the cause of the flood was overpopulation, and that overpopulation is a serious problem, or was then. That's fascinating. And 2 other scholars, Kikuwata and Quinn, say Genesis 1 through 11 then constitutes a rejection of Babel and Babylon, of civilization itself, if its continuance requires human existence to be treated as a contingent or secondary good. For Genesis, the existence of a new human was always good. Okay, so those are what scholars who compare these stories together notice. What else do you notice?
I see resolution as depopulation. Like,
Right,
but
right.
even in the Bible, I mean, but you go all the way to the bottom. I mean, you went to Genesis 11, but like if you get to like the flood, depending on how you read that, I don't know how y'all read it, but if you read it, I mean, it's some kind of depopulation going on because of they all seem to have that similar theme. Like you got depopulation in response to humanity's waywardness. Let's just put it that way, unrighteousness or
Yeah,
whatever.
right.
You see that in it throughout all of them. It's just, but the way that they get there is different. But I don't think that's the final plan in the Bible. But I'm just saying, yeah, I see that same thing.
Yeah, there is similarity, definitely. It so it's interesting that almost every culture, early culture, has a flood story. I mean, that's probably somewhat um, expected because floods cause devastation. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's one flood that everyone's talking about, right? So there's just that. But but in the story of Genesis, the flood comes not because of overcrowding. And we'll get to some more detail, but it comes because Noah and his family are basically the last family of faith. So what God has to do and why he has to do that to protect them is really interesting. So and it wasn't just like, well, he was being exclusive. He doesn't care about everyone else. Like you look at the size of the ark, and if whatever we think about the size of the ark, it, literarily, it's being presented as a huge enclosure, right? Like, and I'm using words from some of the other stories, right? Conceptually, there's some connections. Um, People were invited. Later, the New Testament also refers to Noah as a preacher of righteousness, right? Who said, like, hey, y'all, you need to pay attention. What's different is why the flood comes.
There is something about like the Bible having more moral categories for what's going on, whereas
Yep.
maybe not as much for the other ones, or maybe not at all. But this also brings to mind, I'm sure you'll address it, but like creation and us caring for it and environmentalism, all this kind of stuff, and how that ends up playing a role, Genesis overall.
Sure.
Because
Yep.
some of these other stories could easily, a Christian that cares about a lot of things could easily reference the other stories to like point out overlap in maybe a good way. I don't know, like, oh, we should stop overpopulating the earth and like we're taking care of the earth badly. I don't know.
Actually,
Yeah, I saw that too and thought it was interesting that the difference between in the Genesis account, people are not inherently a threat to nature. And in the other ones, it's kind of like people just can't help the fact that they are damaging to nature.
right.
It seems like with the other stories, yeah, it's like a scarcity mentality of there's not enough resources, so the overpopulation is a problem. And then that creates I got to keep more for myself and less for you.
Yep.
But the Bible portrays more of like God created enough for everybody. It's a mismanagement problem.
Right.
Rather than there wasn't enough in the first place.
Right. A mismanagement it's a moral problem, right? There's a character problem if we bump into this issue. And this gets into question number 2. If you were among, how did I phrase it? The few powerful elites in the ruling class of city-states, by the way, which creation story would you promote?
The one that give me power. I'm just playing.
Well, yeah, sure.
I noticed that in the Greek one, their own national history is centered as being having some cosmic significance, which reminded me a lot of kind of the American exceptionalism that gets bound up with Christianity in America, where we try to insert ourselves into the story as if we're like the center of the universe.
As if all the resources are really just for me or my tribe.
Yeah. I don't know exactly how to like explain this, but for like the 3 non-Hebrew stories, there's sort of an interesting dynamic where like I feel like it would give the culture like a very kind of cautious relationship with God. Like I don't know, with my background as a teacher, it sort of feels like the teacher who's like, don't get too unruly, or like, you're not I'm gonna punish you, like something bad is gonna happen, versus I think the like Hebrew story is much I mean maybe like if somebody was reading it from like just this top down, maybe they could think of the same thing, but I know like in in a more in-depth study, I think what we see is that like God is much more of the teacher who's like, this isn't who you're supposed to be, like you need to come alongside me to like be better, like be who I made you to be. Like it's a very different, and I don't like, as a ruler, like maybe you'd have an ability to have more power to decide over the population, like, hey, we need to stop doing this or the gods are going to get mad at us, or you've seen what happens. But to be in the Hebrew, so like you almost have to take on a humility as a ruler of like, oh, I'm also like one of the humans who's messed up. um and I also have to like rely on God, to like help me out. But that's like a vulnerability that I feel like a leader would be like less comfortable with in comparison to the first three. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Because in the first three, it'd be really easy to tell these stories and say, this is why we kill you, right? This is why we kill you. Because if we don't kill you, the gods will kill all of us. So we have to manage your population. You work for the gods, really us, and you bring food to the gods, really us, and we manage your population. We thin you out when that's necessary, or when we deem that it's appropriate. Or like in the Greek struggle, this is why we go to war, which might make sense given Greek islands and city-states and always smaller rival powers. In any case, the first three stories are stories from the perspective of the city-states that are trying to manage populations. In Genesis, it's not possible to say that, right? Because every single person is important.
All of the stories assume there is a problem. I just, like as something being there. Like, so none of them are saying everything is fine.
Right.
So
right.
that's something interesting to note, that like even the Genesis one is saying there is a problem and humans do have some tendencies that are not great. There's a reason behind that, and God wants to help you with that. But it doesn't say like, that like, yeah, like some default, like, I don't know, that was just interesting because like if you presume nothing, they all say that there is something, everyone is saying there is a problem of something going on.
One more thing before you move on with the moral category. Somebody mentioned moral categories, that the Hebrew text, it was like it had more moral categories. When I'm looking at those stories, I don't see death. Like we talk about things like death. Is death inherent to man, or are the gods behaving in a way that we would consider, I mean, universally moral? It seems like their
Right.
standard is like, it seems like our civilization is built on that last story, the Hebrew story. It's not built on the other stories where the gods seem to just be human beings. Like, think of your worst, just like a glorified, or like a emperor or something who just does what he wants to. Whereas the last one is calling everybody, like they said, to a higher standard. And then you don't see death inherent to the creation, nor sin. I don't see that when I'm reading. It seemed like that came after, that was the result of certain actions that took place. That was a consequence of some things. So I see that too in the stories.
Yes, thanks, Chandler. Yeah, Genesis explains certain things that we experience in a way that is different than the other stories, right? Like ultimately, yeah, it's the result of some kind of choice Adam and Eve made, but that God wants to undo and restore. So like Abraham and Sarah, they're called into a new garden land. What's that like? Hey, that's like Adam and Eve, right? So they're like Adam and Eve 2.0. So why? What is God doing with them? And how is this advancing the story as far as God's purposes are concerned? I'm going to quickly read these two quotes, looking at the ethical significance. So the Genesis 1 through 11 is really the bedrock of what we call human dignity for all, right? Or even human rights for all. So here's historian Paul Johnson. He says, all the great conceptual discoveries of the intellect seem obvious and inescapable once they have been revealed, but it requires a special genius to formulate them for the first time. The Jews had this gift. To them, we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human, of the sanctity of life and the dignity of the human person, of the individual conscience and so of social responsibility, of peace as an abstract ideal and love as the foundation of justice, and many other items which constitute the basic moral furniture of the human mind. Without the Jews, it might have been a much emptier place. So every human being made in the image of God, both men and women, right? Like, and this is why it's so significant that we are not living in the Enuma Elish, where a Marduk, a male figure, kills a female figure in order to create the world. Suspicious? A little, right? Like, but in Genesis, no, God creates male and female, and they have equal dominion. From Genesis 1. Like that's real. And there is no female chaos dragon that he's overcoming. So I'm giving a little bit away, but like we'll get to talk a little bit more. Even the imagery and metaphors, like and genderization of certain things, we have to pay attention to that. And then here's C.S. Lewis, who is an Anglican Christian in the mid 1900s, who added, because of Jesus' resurrection, now we now have resurrection and immortality as part of the picture. He says Christianity asserts that every individual human being is going to live forever, and this must be either true or false. See, and this is still built on Genesis. And immortality makes this other difference, which, by the by, has a connection with the difference between totalitarianism and democracy. If individuals live only 70 years, then a state or a nation or a civilization, which may last for 1,000 years, is more important than an individual. But if Christianity, now he says Christian, but I would say the Bible, if the Bible is true, then the individual is not only more important, but incomparably more important, for he is everlasting, and the life of the state or civilization compared with his or hers is only a moment. That's, and that influences our political life, right? Our communal life, our relational life. How do we honor this? How do we think about human growth? And what is the importance of character development and the hospitality that one person shows towards others? Thomas Cahill writes another book called The Gifts of the Jews. He's a historian who writes more for a popular audience. So if you're interested in things like this, I would totally recommend him.
All evidence points to there having been, in the earliest religious thought, a vision of the cosmos that was profoundly cyclical. The assumptions that early man made about the world were, in all their essentials, little different from the assumptions that later, in more sophisticated societies, like Greece and India, would make in a more elaborate manner. The Jews were the first people to break out of this circle, to find a new way of thinking and experiencing, a new way of understanding and feeling the world, so much that it may be said with some justice that theirs is the only new idea that human beings have ever had.
If we had lived in the second millennium BC, the millennium of Abram, and could have canvassed all the nations of the earth, what would they have said of Abram's journey? In most of Africa and Europe, where prehistoric animism was a norm, and artists were still carving and painting on stone the heavenly symbols of the great wheel of life and death, they would have laughed at Abram's madness and pointed to the heavens, where the life of earth had been plotted from all eternity. His wife is barren as winter, they would say. A man cannot escape his fate. The Egyptians would have shaken their head in disbelief. There is none born wise, they would say, repeating the advice of their most cherished wise men. Copy the forefathers. Teach him what has been said in the past. Then he will set a good example. The early Greeks might have told Abram the story of Prometheus, whose quest for the fire of the gods ended in personal disaster. Do not overreach, they would advise. Come to resignation. In India, he will be told that time is black, irrational, and merciless. Do not set yourself the task of accomplishing something in time, which is only the dominion of suffering. In China, the now anonymous sages whose thoughts would eventually influence the I Ching would caution that there is no purpose in journeys or in any kind of earthly striving. The great thing is to abolish time by escaping from the law of change. The ancestors of the Maya in America would point to their circular calendars, which, like those of the Chinese, repeat the pattern of years in unvarying succession, and would explain everything has been comes around again, and that each man's fate is fixed. On every continent, in every society, Avram would have been given the same advice that wise men as diverse as Heraclitus, Lao Tzu, and Siddhartha would one day give their followers. Do not journey but sit. Compose yourself by the river of life. Meditate on its ceaseless and meaningless flow, on all that is past or passing or to come, until you have absorbed the pattern and have come to peace with the great wheel, and with your own death and the death of all things in the corruptible sphere.
Since time is no longer cyclical, but one way and irreversible, personal history is now possible and an individual life can have value. This new value is at first hardly understood, but already in the earliest accounts of Abraham and his family, we come upon the carefully composed genealogies of ordinary people, something it would never have occurred to Sumerians to write down because they accorded no importance to individual memories. For them, only impersonal survival, like kingship, like the harvest, mattered. The individual, the unusual, the singular, the bizarre, persons or events that did not conform to an archetype could have no meaning. And without the individual, neither time nor history is possible. But the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, no longer your typical ancient divinity, no longer the archetypal gesture, is a real personality who has intervened in real history, changing its course and robbing it of predictability.
For the Jews, history will be always something new, a process unfolding through time whose direction and end we cannot know, except insofar as God gives us some hint of what is to come. The future will not be what has happened before. Indeed, the only reality that the future has is that it has not happened yet. It is unknowable, and what it will be cannot be discovered by auguries, or by reading stars or examining entrails. We do not control the future in a profound sense. Even God does not control the future, because it is the collective responsibility of those who are bringing about the future by their actions in the present. For this reason, the concept of the future for the first time holds out promise rather than just the same old thing. We are not doomed, not bound to some predetermined fate. We are free.
All right. I hope that gives you a rich sense of, wow, this is the story we are going to dive into. And it's really important to know, what are the other stories that are around? Genesis seems to be aware of them, right? It's aware and it's arguing with them. Which story would you prefer to live in? And why?
Good back and forth in the chat. I'm just going to read it for the sake of time, but if either of you two want to speak up. So Adam says, I can see how a cyclical future might be of comfort to people from a larger cultural perspective. Haley says it's pretty nihilistic. It would make grim sense out of suffering in a twisted way. If your individual suffering didn't matter, then disassociate. Haley also adds, but the need to make sense out of suffering says that we have eternity inside of our hearts.
Thanks. Yes. I mean, growing up, my family of origin was semi-Buddhist, right? And so in Buddhism, it's cyclical. There is no final good triumphing over evil. The most you can hope for, the way to make sense of that is you have to transcend everything and escape into either nothingness or some kind of afterlife. So, but whether you have any hope of changing the world as it is, there's not much. In fact, there is none. So that's a form of disassociation, I would argue.
Because I agree. I think that whoever said that there's this cyclical can actually feel comforting to some people, even though it may logically not make any sense, right? It's kind of a fatalism. But I think for a lot of people, for some reason, they're finding it. And they're finding comfort in that, even though it really leaves no room for hope for the end of injustice, right? But I just think that it's really important to sit with that as much as we can. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to say too, in regards to this cyclical theme, I don't think it's completely wrong either. I don't think that it's wrong to see cycles in human history. I think the Bible shows that. It's just that the Bible also shows an end to the story. And it's kind of like we keep spinning our wheels, and that's where the cyclical thing comes in. And it's just the same sin pattern over and over again. We can't come to a resolution, but there is a resolution at the end. There's a telos.
Yes, yes. And there are patterns that humanity and God wind up engaging in. And so there is a rhyming to biblical history and to biblical stories. And so that's why it's so important to start with Genesis, because you see that rhyming dynamic in other parts of the Bible. my second question was, who do you think invented the story of Genesis 1 through 11? Like, is this just a human creation? I don't think so, right? I'm persuaded that there is a loving God who created and wanted good things for human beings. That's once you compare this story with other stories, it's hard to at least not start to feel like, wow. And then number 3, how does Genesis 1 through 11 serve as a helpful context to define God or even humanity? Recall how context helps define words like this. I'm mad about my flat. Sometimes I think we project fallen or flawed authority figures onto God, and we fill the word God with content that really it should not be there. And the story of Genesis is trying to actually do a reboot on the word God, right? I mean, that's one of the things that's happened. The only thing they and the way they do that is to tell a different story. Words and contexts, right? Like the context of these words about like, what does it mean? What do we mean by God? What does it mean to be human? Even are shaped by the story. And this is, I think, the only way that they could have done it. The question of, do we live in a story where good triumphs over evil, where beauty triumphs over ugliness, where justice triumphs over injustice? I think that in the West, we tend to take it for granted that that's true, right? We watch a lot of Disney, and the hero triumphs over the villain. The scientist finds a cure at the last minute. The lawyer persuades the jury in the end, right? Like there's some happy ending story. And I think that there's some draw that we have to that because we are made in the image of a God who has better things in store than he even began with. And so that makes sense to me, but I think the value of going back into this history is to say, but that's not just a foregone conclusion. That's not a given. It's not even true that most human beings believed in some kind of happy ending story. Now we need to be careful about like what kind of happy ending story do we live in? Like who's the villain here? Is it immigrants? Is it I mean any number of things. So we need to be really careful. And there are certainly parodies of that story that that I would say this was one of the first things that happened as people backed away from the biblical story and tried to fill it with Eurocentric content or some other thing that said like, well, what we have is better than what other people have, so that must be the happy ending story. No, there's something else. There's something else that this God is doing for all humanity that Genesis is going to show us, like, what's the foundation of that and where does he go from there? Where do we go from there? How can we participate in the restoration of this world? The partnership that God shows with humans in the repair of that world is what makes some of these quotes that we read totally powerful, right? Like the future is somewhat indeterminate. There's an openness to it. And it's exciting to participate in the groundwork or because we continue in the patterns, the rhythm, the rhyming of that story. All right, so I hope that was a decent introduction. I'm going to stop the video now. And for those of you watching the video, there may be extra notes in the email that I sent out. Okay, we'll see you next time.